the President of the Observer Research Foundation, my colleague and friend, Mr. Samir Saran, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Often it has fallen to my remit at conferences of the Observer Research Foundation to sing for my breakfast, but singing for my supper, I think this would be a first with the Observer Research Foundation today. Before I commence to reflect on the subject, as Mr. Joshi was mentioning, you've had an extremely fruitful day, and I would like to thank and congratulate the Observer Research Foundation for holding this conference on a subject which is extremely topical and has been agitating the minds of not only policymakers but more importantly people all around the world. Invariably at conferences like this, especially when I have my very dear friends and my constant companions present, I begin with the confession that whatever I say out here, I speak for myself, and it would be inappropriate for me to be really binding the government of India to the views which I express at any academic fora. Of course, if there are any questions later as to what aspect falls within the domain of the policy of the government of India, I would be more than happy to answer that either publicly or privately. Samir and Mr. Joshi asked me to reflect on the concept and the idea of the freedom of expression in the age of the internet. Before I dwell on this subject, let me first try and broadly map the fundamental transformation that has changed and defined the communication landscape over the past 2 decades. Maybe thereafter I would try and ideate on how this and other factors have shaped the whole discourse on the freedom of expression in the very interesting times that we live in. It would be a non sequitur to say that the new frontier in the cyber age is undoubtedly digital. Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, in their seminal treatise, The New Digital Age, made some very prescient observations which I have paraphrased as follows. The internet is perhaps the largest experiment involving anarchy in the world. And it has succeeded. Those last 4 words are mine. Today, the internet represents the largest ungoverned space on planet Earth. Never before in the history of mankind have so many people from so many places had so much power on their fingertips. Every 2 days, more digital content is created than from the dawn of civilization until 2003. What is evolving is a tale of 2 civilizations. One physical that has evolved over the millennia, and one virtual that is very much in the formation. The new media, or the social media as we call it, rides on the back of this World Wide Web. In India, as we speak, there are 124 million people who use the internet. The figure is expected to grow to 370 million by 2017. Facebook tells me that they have 80 million people as their customers in India. Twitter says that they have 18 million. And I know that this entire universe is expanding exponentially every day. And now, here lies the rub. Over 2 decades ago, English, French, Spanish, Russian, and now Mandarin, and some other international languages have been the medium of diplomacy, literature, governance, social interaction, and trade. These languages now have a new companion, one that promises to shape an overwhelming architecture of human engagement in the days ahead. It is called binary, and it is the language of digital communication. Many years ago, the 10 numerals were replaced by 2, that is 1 and 0 in the binary model. Today, the same is happening with language, where the English alphabet soup, when digitized, is reflected by a 1 and a 0. Alongside language, behavior and norms too are increasingly conditioned by this binary on and off, yes and no, are the stark rules of conduct on the internet. We are confronted by a new dual reality, one in which the entire digital world is a binary governed by 1 and 0, and the interface and regulation is still human or analog, as humans, except for some of us, still do not live in the binary. Therefore, this is the real debate. In the digital world, privacy is either on or it is off. In the real world, it is much more nuanced. In the digital world, freedom of expression is either on or off. In the real world, again, it's far more subtle, if not complex. The reality is that we are struggling with shaping the analog interface to the digital world. It's ironic because it is the classical case of the tail wagging the dog, for the lack of a better expression. This conference is being held to ideate solutions on how, fundamentally, an analog civilization will come up with responses to an emerging digital civilization that is just beginning to appear over the horizon. What we are experiencing is technology rapidly outpacing our cognitive abilities limited by vocabulary. What we confront is a digitally reactive society, either unwilling or unable to evolve responses to a rapidly changing milieu. While these challenges do stare us in the face, I don't think that there is any room for digital chauvinism, for the simple reason that one person's freedom can very rapidly translate into another person's fright. And then the question emerges as to who intervenes, who decides what is freedom and what is fright. For all the absolute privacy and the absolute freedom of speech advocates here and around the world, I would say, fine, but what solutions are you offering for those most likely to get hurt by your absolutism? Are you in fact offering solutions except stating your rights? Who intervenes, and more importantly, who protects, I think is an equally important question. Or are we going to become the Wild West, cowboy country, or continue to be an ethos or a civilization which is still governed by certain rules and by certain norms? We hear both sides of the debate every day. What we are looking for is the median, the balance that will lead to solutions. Should we allow trespassers will be shot type of rules for encroaching on personal cyberspace? What are the personal boundaries? Is it feasible to allow real-world norms to flow to the virtual world without real-world laws also following suit in their wake? Of course, all of this will have to be in the context that the internet is a challenge and an opportunity without a passport, and hence laws and norms will need to be reimagined if they are to be effective. Yet it does not mean that we cede the task of governance to the unknown and the variables without a constant, and in a sense allow Darwinism to define cyber reality, or for that matter, hijack democratic processes. What right now seems to be perhaps the law of the jungle, running under Darwinian principles, but it has to be made accountable and responsive to the greater common good. then the quintessential question would emerge. And it would, of course, be raised as to who defines common good. And to that, I would like to respond in all humility that democratically elected governments still represent the legitimate will of the people even today. Conversely, if we look at the other side of the argument, we must also accept anarchy to a degree must be the salient feature of the internet domain. And in that sense, it gives voice to millions and reach to those without access. We must also allow a million mutinies to flower on the net as they unleash creativity and entrepreneurship, which refines the human experiment on a daily basis. The reality also is that without there being a jungle somewhere, evolution and the survival of the fittest invariably comes to a grinding halt. But here lies the paradox again. On one hand, the cyber world enables grassroots democratization like nothing before. But on the other, we have seen the same medium also having the potential for enormous destruction inflicted through the same rights that enable emancipation, and invariably and unfortunately, the victim, more often than not, are the newly emancipated. While no government, and I repeat this, that no government must seek to restrict this feature, and those who try to do so do it at their own peril. We have seen this happening with the Great Firewall of China, where in spite of a ban on Facebook and Twitter, the Chinese social media, the Weibos, if I pronounce the word correctly, has grown just as big and loud, with the government hard-pressed to control it. Given how big and how quickly the Weibo has proliferated, a turn back to a no social media paradigm is something which even the most battle-hardened, hardline Chinese Communist Party, a Pratik, possibly also would not be able to implement. We in India have been grappling with this question. As most of you know, freedom of expression is guaranteed by our constitution. However, it has reasonable restrictions. Therefore, in the offline world, while protest and dissidence is allowed, if the government feels that it could cause communal disharmony or become a law and order situation, it has to step in and do the policing. The conundrum is how these shades of gray would play out in the black and white world of binary. In the past year and a half, some major incidents have reinvigorated the discourse as to how the potential problem of offensive communication over the internet needs to be or can be surmounted. I think during your deliberations today, somebody must have flagged the mass panic and exodus of people from the northeastern part of India who had to flee from cities in South India in July last because of mischievous messaging that claimed that they would be targeted if they do not leave. Now, despite messages from the government over the same medium, we could not ebb that exodus. Ultimately, government had to cut SMSs to only 5 a day to stop further spread of new rumors. In Jammu and Kashmir, the chief minister took a decision to block the internet for some time when news of the innocence of Muslims video took the world by a storm. He did not want to risk any flare-ups in a state of the kind being seen in other parts of the world. Similarly, last month in the central Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, there were riots in a city called Muzaffarnagar, and there was news of a video on YouTube which inadvertently ended up fanning these flames of communal passion. In that situation, one must wonder, what should the government's action be? On one hand, it is believed that the person who initially posted this video a few years back did so to raise public outrage against extrajudicial executions. brutal lynching. This is indeed a noble cause. Yet, a couple of years later, you see the same video being circulated to fan communal conflagration. Now, intent of the initial poster, those who posted it during the riots, recent riots in North India, is easy to pinpoint. This is unusual. Most often, intent becomes very difficult to prove. Given this paradigm, we must pause to consider at what point a personal tweet, essentially a digital freedom of expression, turns into a mass broadcast, a telecommunications business in effect, one that you would agree should certainly be amenable to certain standards of accountability at least. When talking of the internet and freedom of expression, it is easy to be absolutist when you are not responsible for keeping the peace. However, everyone must remember that along with the wonderful positive development the internet has brought us, creativity, employment, e-government, and more connectivity, there are areas which are hidden from the public view that are negative. This is the dark net, as the scholars call it, and they consist of terrorist networks, cyber criminals, and other insidious networks that aim to twist the internet to their advantage, what I often refer to as the spectre of the hidden people. There is no choice for governments but to be alert. The entire point of this conference, as was explained to me, the CyFy, is to discuss some mechanisms to ensure that the internet stays positive, freedom of cyber navigation is instaured, and the internet remains free and safe, just like any of our other global commons. But there is more to democracy. It is the responsibility of government to keep you safe, even when you are fast asleep. What should the government do when it knows certain people are using the internet to fan violence? This is where concepts of surveillance, monitoring, cyber experts come in. This is the real world we unfortunately live in. Should not the government have both a legal and technological way to stop such activity? As we see cases in the real world where indisputable rights require courts to intervene to enforce them. We've seen this debate over Park 51 Islamic Center in Manhattan, also in Europe where legal mechanisms finally enabled the building of a mosque in Marseille that was opposed by legal residents. Now, if this is the case of rights in the real world, I fail to see why the outrage or what is in effect the baby steps of norms evolving in the virtual civilization. Being a democracy, it's imperative that business and civil society come to become a part of this process, to come to the table, to take a multi-stakeholder approach to talking about how best to keep the freedom of expression alive in the internet age. And this sometimes means deciding what our safeguards are, where the digital red lines are, and the nuances of the new language of our times, the binary. In any democracy, the sine qua non is the freedom of the people, but the social contract that freedom is based on guarantees, security, but the social contract also entails that the freedom is based on guarantees, security to these same citizens. One is not exclusive of the other, rather I would argue they are deeply symbiotic. We need to seriously introspect as to what would happen if agreed rules of international engagement do not emerge as a binding international compact that encompasses states and other entities that control the underlying hardware of the net. Would this lead to the balkanization of the internet? A related question which also needs to be considered is access to the internet considered a right, or is it a privilege, or is it a market good? That is, if you can't afford it, then you should remain offline. Should internet openness be at all filtered, monitored, obstructed, or manipulated, as some people refer to it? What restrictions may exist in response to the potential legal, economic, and security challenges raised by the new media? And finally, the question which possibly really keeps policymakers awake at night. At what point in time does a cyber attack qualify as an act of war in the physical space? This transformed communication paradigm has its implications on social ethics, social milieu, and social norms. In fact, the time is just ripe to also introspect about the distinction between the right to privacy and the right to anonymity. For instance, one should not feel free to launch hate campaigns in the name of right to anonymity and infringe upon someone's privacy. Therefore, all stakeholders should deliberate the need to strike a right balance, or in other words, find the equilibrium between the right to privacy and, if at all, there's a right to anonymity. 5 billion people are expected to join the net in the next decade. It could happen sooner. Thus, the internet will spread to some of the most remote and at the same time some of the most unstable parts of the world. This will mean increased information access to healthcare, education, and just as much a more connected world. But we must be aware that there is a lack of a delete button on the internet. As we become more and more active offline, the digital imprint that we create will only increase. This is especially true for young people growing up now, many of whom use online platforms as a natural extension of their physical lives. By the time a man or a person is in his 40s, he would have accumulated and stored a comprehensive online narrative, all facts and fictions, every misstep and every triumph spanning every phase of his life. Even rumors will live forever on the internet. Let me conclude by quoting President Franklin Roosevelt, who said, and I quote, "The only sure bulwark of continuing liberty is a government strong enough to protect the interests of the people, and a people strong enough and well enough informed to maintain its sovereign control over the government." This, ladies and gentlemen, is the balance we all seek. This is, I think, the task of this conference and many other conferences which would be held in the future, to find this golden mean. And I can assure you that policymakers around the world would be listening and taking on board very seriously the solutions that you have to propose. Once again, I would like to thank the Observer Research Foundation for inviting me here, and for all of you having had to bear with this harangue at dinner time. Thank you very much.